All right. And it's a way to motivate and stimulate action and basically to try and lead states to actually do more than what they've promised to do. And this is one of the reasons why the Paris Agreement will be revisable every 5 years. Well, will be more than revisable. Will be revised more than 5 years. And every 5 years, the countries will be invited to revise their commitment and to see if they can do more. We'll see about that. The first revision will happen in 2023. That is in an awful lot of time. We need to be aware of what such a world at plus 4 degrees would mean. I remember vividly that back in 2009, I attended a conference at Oxford University which looked at the consequences of a plus 4 degree world. And at that time, that was only 6 years ago, the conference looked like a science fiction exercise, like an intellectual exercise. Let's try and think what the world would look like if temperature increase were to reach 4 degrees. We're now 6 years later only, and this hypothesis, which was considered as a science fiction scenario only 6 years ago, is now considered as the most plausible, most realistic hypothesis by an increasing number of climate scientists. Obviously, a plus 4 degree world would have absolutely devastating consequences, including consequences for humanity. And I think what we need to realize is that the difference between plus 2 and plus 4 degrees would mean a shift in two directions. First, a shift when it comes to the issue of habitability. Habitability means that if temperature reaches 4 degrees, quite a significant number of regions of the world would become uninhabitable. If you think about it, at the moment, human life is present pretty much everywhere in the world, with the exception of a few areas like the north of Siberia or the middle of Sahara. Basically, we live pretty much everywhere on the planet. If we reach 4 degrees, this will no longer be possible. And many areas of the world will become uninhabitable because temperature will reach 7 or 8 or 9 degrees of increase. This means that human life will no longer be possible in some places of the world. This will imply, logically, a redistribution of the population on a global scale. Redistributing population, well, good luck with that. I mean, if you look at the current political crisis in Europe, which has been triggered by the arrival of a few 100,000 refugees from Syria, desperate to save their lives, and the inability of Europe, one of the richest places of the world, with 28 democratic countries sharing common values and common policies, unable to agree on a mechanism to distribute amongst themselves a few 100,000 refugees, imagine the difficulty of having that conversation on a global scale to discuss the redistribution of not just a few 100,000 people, but a few 100 million people. Clearly, we are not ready at all for this conversation. And clearly, the mechanisms of global governance of migration are not in place at all at the moment. And in most countries, in most industrialized countries, and I assume in Chile as well, the public debate on migration is often quite polarized, fueled with lies, extremism, racism, and xenophobia, as it is the case on a worldwide scale today. The second issue, if we move from 2 to 4 degrees, the second shift, so to say, will be the shift of tipping points. One of the reasons why 2 degrees was chosen as the objective not to overshoot is not just because it was a political compromise, because the emission reductions that seemed achievable and the climate impacts that seemed tolerable, but also because of science. Climate scientists are able pretty much, with a relative level of certainty and of confidence, to predict and project the impacts of climate change up to 2 degrees of temperature increase. If we move beyond 2 degrees, we also enter a terra incognita. That means that a lot of impacts of climate change in the current state of science can no longer be predicted beyond 2 degrees. And a major concern of scientists is the possibility that some tipping points might be reached if we go past 2 degrees. And tipping points are thresholds from which the climate system would actually trigger irreversible and dramatic changes, and one of them would be the possible melting of the Arctic ice sheets. If the Arctic ice sheets were to melt completely, then we can expect that the sea level rise would be an average of 6 meters on a worldwide scale. And this is what Europe would look like. That would be fun. The reason I'm showing you this map produced by the National Geographic magazine is not to scare you off, but to show you the significant differences between continents. Obviously, European governments will not let this happen. Obviously, the Dutch and Danish governments would do everything possible to save their countries. The Italian governments have already taken the measure so that Venice would survive and would be kept afloat. So obviously there would be dikes and lots of significant infrastructure adaptation measures. The problem would be here. On this map live a majority of the people in the world. There are about 4 billion people living just on this map. And clearly it will not be possible there to afford all the dikes and dams and sea defense systems that Europe would put in place. So we would need to make some choices between the territories that we will intend to protect and the territories that we will need to sacrifice. And this will not be an easy choice. Take the case of Bangladesh, 165 million inhabitants, half of the territory under sea level rise, one of the poorest countries on the surface of the planet. Well, if the sea level rises by 6 meters, basically Bangladesh is gone. So either you put a dike everywhere, dikes absolutely everywhere in the country, because not only will they face floods from sea level rise, but they will also face riparian floods because of the melting of the glaciers in the Himalaya, or you relocate the population. That's 165 million people, Muslims, in a region that is not easy at all, to say the least. So to prevent this from happening, India has already built a security fence along its border with Bangladesh. That's a fence that is 3,500 kilometers long to make sure that there will be no illegal migrant from Bangladesh entering India. So the adaptation measure taken by India to prevent itself against this possible scenario has just been to build a fence. And the same could be said for many, many other countries. Look at the huge area that would be flooded between Beijing and Shanghai, which is one of the most populated areas of the world. This leads me to say that climate change brings more than environmental impacts, and that there are now seemingly recognized significant security issues and migration issues and political issues at large related to climate change. And I think this is a major shift that has happened at the COP21. It is that for years, climate change was considered as an environmental issue. That is an issue that could be solved with technical measures and technical solutions. And for years, the climate negotiations have been considered as technical negotiations that could be kept separately from other kinds of negotiations. And for about 10 years, there have been many scientific reports, many scientific shows, telling the world that one should not consider climate change as an environmental issue, but as a political issue. As a political issue because in the origins of climate change, there are very significant collective choices that are the reason for climate change. And I think it's extremely important to realize the collective choices that constitute the root of climate change. And these collective choices have a lot to do with inequalities. Inequalities of emissions, but also inequalities of power between the North and the South in the negotiations. For years, when we've communicated to the public about climate change, we have insisted on the little changes that they can make in their everyday life. I mean, they could use less water, they could use more public transportation, they need to switch off the lights and use low consumption light bulbs. They needed to consume food produced locally and so on and so forth. All of that is important and necessary, but on a worldwide scale represent only about 15% of the emissions. Only 15% of the emissions on a worldwide scale are determined by individual behaviors, by individual consumption choices. The rest, the other 85%, are related to collective choices. Which means that until now, when discussing climate change, we've addressed people as consumers rather than as citizens. As if we were turning a blind eye on the collective choices that were the root causes of climate change. So for this reason, climate change is definitely a political issue, because it is dependent on the way our societies and economies are organized. But climate change is also a political issue in its consequences, because of the migration issues, because of the security issues that it entails. And obviously, as first strong signal came in 2007 when Al Gore and the IPCC were awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace. The IPCC is made up primarily of physicists, geophysicists, and astrophysicists. And yet, they got a Nobel Prize for Peace rather than for physics. And it highlighted the fact that there was some sort of an official acknowledgement by the Nobel Committee that climate change represented a threat to the security and stability of the world. It represents a threat to the survival of some island nations. Tuvalu is one of them, others include Kiribati, the Marshall Islands, the Cook Islands, or the Maldives, simply because the low elevation of the territory might not allow them to survive a sea level rise of more than 1 meter. Climate change is also a cause for migration across the world. And something that is still not fully recognized in migration studies is the fact that environmental disruptions, many of them related to climate change, have now become the #1 driver of migration and displacement worldwide. We don't have many data yet, we don't have many statistics yet, but what we need to know is that every year on average, 26 million people are displaced by natural disasters only. That's 1 person every second. That is, on a yearly average, 3 times more people displaced by natural disasters than displaced by war, violence, and persecutions. And yet, we have also reached an all-time high when it came to the people displaced by war and violence. And despite this, there are even 3 times more people displaced by natural disasters. And on top of this displacement, we need to account for the number of people displaced by the slow onset impacts of climate change, including, of course, sea level rise or soil degradation. Climate change is also a security issue, and many studies indicate a very strong correlation between violence and changes in temperature and in precipitations. At the moment, we can only observe these correlations, and we need more engagement from the social sciences to come up with explanatory models for such correlations. And obviously, correlation doesn't mean causality. But we have really strong signals that any changes in temperature or in precipitation leads to an increase of wars and civil conflict, not just in Africa, but also in industrialized countries. In the US, for example, the hotter it gets, the more people get killed by each other. Obviously, correlation doesn't mean causality, and there are other explanations, including social explanations, why people kill each other more when temperature rises. But we need to be aware of the fact that a warmer world will also be a more violent world. Another security issue is the issue of the territories related to sea level rise. And strangely enough, for a reason that I fail to understand, this is not yet on the security radar. On this map, NASA has simulated a scenario that is today virtually certain, that is the scenario of a 1 meter sea level rise across the globe. Look at the huge amount of territory that will be lost by Chile on the south coast. I just want to take the case of Vietnam. Vietnam, in the event of a 1 meter sea level rise, which is, as I said, virtually certain now, will lose 25,000 square kilometers. 25,000 square kilometers, that is the equivalent of 10% of the territory of Vietnam. And Vietnam being basically a very long coast, most likely the Vietnamese government will not be able to afford a long dike along the coast. So the Vietnamese government will need to choose which territory, which portions of its territory it decides to protect, and which portions of its territory it decides to sacrifice. Which populations it decides to relocate, and which populations it decides to protect. Clearly, this will not be an easy choice. And I think we fail to understand the conflict potentials of such losses of territory. We know from history that the win or loss of territories has always been a major driver of war and conflict. Most wars and conflicts in recent history happened because of territory. And yet, we are now on the edge, of a phenomenon when countries would lose up to 10% of their territory, and that doesn't seem to worry us more than that. I mean, one of the recent conflicts in the region in history, as you know, was in the Malwines between Argentina and the UK, where basically these two countries fought for a few islands that were barely inhabited. Sorry? And they're going to disappear anyway.
But the fight has never been for the island, for reaction.
Yeah, obviously. But so what I want to highlight here is the conflict potential of such territorial issues when it comes to climate change. Yes?
Do you know how long it will take for the sea to rise 1 meter?
Oh yes, that's by the end of the century. So this is the situation in 85 years from now.
85.
Give or take 1 year. So obviously the question is, why don't we act practically to avoid this? And I want to have some reflections now on why it took us so long to achieve an agreement in Paris and what the agreement in Paris can actually achieve. So this is one of the biggest failures in recent history. Some of you might have been there at the COP15 in Copenhagen. And I've highlighted the picture because the Danish organizers of the conference had a really great idea of removing all the clocks in all meeting rooms and to replace them with these countdowns So if you want to make everyone nervous and anxious, I strongly advise you to remove all clocks in the rooms and replace them with countdowns. So in every meeting, you would see the clock ticking. And obviously, there are many, many reasons why Copenhagen did not achieve what it should have. And we've often talked of the COP15 in Copenhagen as the last chance meeting, as the 11th hour meeting to rescue the planet. And in many regards, it was. And in many regards, we need to realize that it is in Copenhagen that we've probably missed the opportunity of limiting climate change to 2 degrees. I mean, if we want to confront things realistically. So that was not a kind of overused expression. That was indeed the last chance to do that. And the 6 years that we've lost between Copenhagen and now, and the 5 years that we will lose between now and 2020, that is the moment when the Paris Agreement will be implemented, will likely prove terrible for climate action. Because this is something that we should not forget. It is that not only have we lost 6 years between Copenhagen and now, but we will lose 5 more years because the Paris Agreement, as good as it is, will not be implemented before 2020. And the first commitments of the parties will not be revised before 2023. If we take a kind of broader view, I think we need to realize that there are 3 key reasons why we have failed to act so far and why it is so difficult to act on climate change. The first reason is that there is absolutely no relationship between the quantities of greenhouse gas that are emitted by one country and the impacts of climate change that will be suffered by this country. And in a similar fashion, there is absolutely no relationship between the quantities of greenhouse gas that are emitted by one generation and the impacts of climate change that will be experienced by this generation. So there is a double injustice. There is first a geographical injustice, because as you know, the countries that will be first and most affected by climate change tend to be developing countries located around the equator. And there is also a generational injustice, because the generation that will be the most affected by the impacts of climate change will be the generation of our grandchildren, because of the time lag of about 50 years that occurs between the moment when we send greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere and the reaction of the climate. This is something that most people don't understand. Most people like to think that there is an immediate consequence to their actions. And in order to act, most people will need to see the results of their action. And one of the reasons why action on the climate is so difficult is because people don't have the ability to experience by themselves the consequences of their actions. This means that the fight against climate change is not waged for us, but for the others. For people who live very far away in countries where most of the citizens of industrialized countries will never set foot, and for generations that are not born yet. Which means that the negotiations on climate change needs to be, by essence, altruistic. The countries that need to act need to do so not for themselves, but for the others. And this is the reason why climate change is also a moral issue, because it asks us to consider how important is the other for us, and what kind of sacrifice we're ready to make for the others, for people living beyond our boundaries, for people living beyond our generation. And as you know, international negotiations, I'm afraid, are not very good at being altruistic. Because each country pursues its own national interest. And this is also what is expected from governments. And governments are not to blame for that. Populations expect governments to pursue the national interest of the country. And finally, a third reason why climate action is so difficult is because there are lots of people, as strong as the civil society mobilization can be these days, there are also lots of people in interests who simply don't want governments to act. If you take the top 10 companies in the world, considering their value in the stock market, 8 of them out of 10 depend directly on oil. They're either oil companies, or car manufacturers, or chemical companies. Which means that the business model of these 8 top companies in the world depend on oil. And if we move away from oil, if we move towards a post-carbon economy, then it will become a very serious problem for these companies because they will need to reinvent themselves completely. So I'm not saying that these companies are foes and that it's impossible to work with them, but they will need to change radically their business model in a post-carbon world. And then finally, we should not forget the fact that there are lots of people who don't want governments to act, including climate skeptics. And climate skepticism is a very strong force in industrialized countries. And we should not, I know that in this audience, we all tend to consider climate skepticism as a kind of thing of foolish people and of crazy idiots. Okay. Okay.
Be careful.
And I'll be careful then. So there are significant issues that are associated with climate skepticism, and we should not underestimate the power of climate skepticism in the fight against climate change. If you take European electorates, for example, in 2010, about 3 British voters out of 4 could be defined as skeptical about climate change. Because either they did not accept the reality of climate change, or they questioned the role of human beings in triggering climate change, or simply because they were convinced that scientists were not sure and that therefore there was no reason for climate action. In France, about 1/3 of the electorate considers themselves as climate skeptics. And actually, if you go deeper by age and gender, we find out that 62% of the population aged 60 plus in France is skeptical about climate change. And most CEOs of companies, most business leaders, as you know, are aged over 60. So one of the programs that we've led at the Politics of the Earth program is to try and to find out whether it was a kind of generation gap. That is, shall we just wait for these people to die and for climate skepticism to die with them? Or will young people get climate skeptic as they get older as well? So this is one of the research projects that we have at the moment, which looks at the correlation between age and climate skepticism. And then obviously, climate skepticism is even more important in the US, where, as you know, most of the representative of the Republican Party at the moment in the US are climate skeptic, which makes that the US Senate skeptical about climate change, let's put it this way, which is one of the reasons why the Paris Agreement cannot be and will not be legally binding, because if it had to be legally binding, that means that it would have had to be ratified by the US Senate, which was impossible given that the US Senate at the moment is dominated by Republicans who tend to be skeptical about climate change. So climate skepticism in the US has had very direct consequences on the Paris Agreement and on its legally binding nature. So one of the key weaknesses of the Paris Agreement is that it does not contain any obligations for everyone. And the reason it does not contain any obligation is primarily because the US Senate is dominated by climate skeptics. And as a matter of fact, the agreement was very close to derailing in the final hours of the conference because of that. And you might have read the anecdote in the press. So the session for adopting the Paris Agreement was scheduled at 5:30 and was delayed by about 1 hour, 1.5 because the US delegation found out that there had been a typo in the agreement where the word shall was included, and they wanted it replaced with the word should. The word shall meant that they would have had to have the agreement ratified by the US Senate, whereas that was no longer necessary if the word shall was replaced by should. So some might say, what difference does it make? It makes a hell of a difference about whether the Paris Agreement could survive or whether it would have been killed by the US Senate. And this led to a domino effect because Nicaragua, which was, let's put it this way, not very strongly in favor of the Paris Agreement, tried to use this opportunity to open a further round of negotiation on the Paris Agreement. And it was only because of some intense pressure from the Chinese delegation on both the US and Nicaragua that eventually the Paris Agreement was adopted. So the little history will remember that the Paris Agreement was adopted thanks to China. And this is a major reversal in what we knew from the previous negotiations. And China was very adamant that the agreement had to be adopted and that there was no further opening of any round of negotiations. Now, bringing the issue to a, I don't want to say more metaphysical stage, but I think that we need to realize what the entry into the Anthropocene means for international relations. As you know, the Anthropocene is the name given by some geologists who think that we've now entered a new geological era, succeeding the Holocene. We would have entered the Anthropocene, called the Age of Humans. That is the official recognition that humans have now become the leading forces of transformation of the planet. Changing geological age is quite unusual. It happens every, 20,000 years. So our generation has been lucky enough to experience a change of millennia. We're also experiencing apparently a change of geological era. There are still many disagreements and disputes amongst geologists as to know how this new era should be called, when it begins, whether it has started or not. But anyway, what is for sure, it has, as a concept, already entered the realm of social sciences. And I think that it signals a major change in the way we envision international relations. And for a very long time, we've considered that the Earth and the world were two very different things. We've considered that the Earth, at least in international relations, we've considered that the Earth was regulated by the laws of biology, physics, and chemistry, whereas the world was regulated by the laws of politics and economics. And that the world, in a way, was the social and political organization of the Earth, and that the Earth was a kind of backdrop to human actions and interactions. We've even created a sub-discipline of that called geopolitics, which was the study of the human interactions around natural resources, as if natural resources, as if the environment was a backdrop for human interactions. And we've now come to realize that we could no longer consider the environment, the Earth, as an object, but that we had to consider it as a subject. Because not only did we influence and transform the Earth, but the changes to the Earth system was also deeply transforming the conditions of human life on the planet. Which is the reason why in international relations, the Anthropocene means that we can no longer consider the Earth and the world separately from each other. That we need to consider them as one single entity. For international relations, this means that international relations, in a way, have to become real geopolitics, that is literally politics of the Earth. And I think this is how we should envision international relations. The problem is that the negotiations on climate change are still, to a wide extent, prisoners of the Holocene. And that the way we negotiate around these issues has not yet taken a full account of the changes brought upon by the Anthropocene. Because the actors that are around the negotiating table are still governments, which means that there are many entities that are not represented in the negotiations. That there are entities responsible for collective choices, such as municipalities or regions, for example, or NGOs, but also non-state entities. And it was extremely striking in the COP21 to see that there were many constituencies lobbying and pressuring the negotiators for their constituency to be represented in the agreement. There was a constituency for oceans, a constituency for forest, a constituency for agriculture, a constituency for future generations, for indigenous people, for a lot of non-state entities. And these groups were pushing for their constituency to be included in the agreement. I just want to take the example of oceans. Obviously, there are lots of interactions between the climate and the ocean systems, and there are lots of reasons to discuss about oceans in agreement on climate change. And yet, oceans were not featured in the agreement. And let's call them the ocean community, that is, researchers, companies, NGOs, the Prince Albert of Monaco, gathered together, all of that funded by Monaco, for oceans to be recognized in the agreement. They organized an Oceans Day, they organized lots of demonstrations, lots of talks, lots of meetings with the negotiators to try to convince them to include oceans in the agreement. And a major victory, I mean, they were popping the champagne last week because the word oceans was featured once in the preamble of the agreement. And that was for them a major victory. Oceans were in the agreement. They had managed to have a non-state entity being represented in the agreement. And in a way, we might think this is a little strange that people had to fight for years, organize countless events, spend countless amounts of money. Well, Monaco money, so it does not really matter. But all of this to have just the word ocean be mentioned once and just once in the agreement. There is also a problem of cooperation. We have not, I think, completely accounted for the deep transformations of the world and of the system of international negotiations that have occurred since Copenhagen. Until Copenhagen, the idea was still that international agreements should come first and national policies should come second and should be derived from an international agreement. After Copenhagen, the problem has been that emerging countries have said, well, we no longer accept this system where, let me pick that for you. We no longer accept this system where all national policies have to depend upon international agreements. We want to be able to determine what we want to do on the national level first, and then we'll see if there are some possibilities to coordinate this on the international level. And we need to realize now that what matters are national policies and no longer international agreement. And so I'm sorry to say, but as nice as the Paris Agreement is, it is not what matters. What matters actually are the INDCs, that is the national policies that will be implemented in each country. And these are the real climate policies. And the climate policies will be determined first and foremost by these national choices. So the international agreement can send signals, can provide guidance, but they cannot provide constraint on national policies. And I think that we need to realize this fully in order not to be fooled by some fantasies of international law. Let's put it this way. Third, we have a problem of time. We don't realize that time is running out. And even when we negotiate an agreement like Paris, we give 5 more years of delay before the implementation. And yet, we know, and science tells us, that we have a very short window of time to act. Certainly, we know that the peak of emissions worldwide cannot happen later than in 2020, that is in 5 years from now. And quite often we've been under the impression that in the negotiations on climate change, the subject of the negotiation were the negotiations themselves rather than climate change. Fourth, we still have a problem of representation. And I think this is the major success of the Paris Agreement in that regard. Climate change means very different things in different countries. For some, it's a matter of survival. For others, a matter of development. For others, it's a matter of new technology and technology transfer. And I deeply believe that the solution to a problem depends a lot on the representation that we have of this problem. And until the Paris Agreement, there was not a kind of common representation of climate change, not a kind of common vision that would integrate the different representations of what climate change meant. And I think this is probably the biggest success of Paris, is that for the first time, they've managed to integrate these different interests into one common text of representation of climate change. Now the challenge, at least the way I see it, is to make of the fight against climate change a political stimulating project. And very often when we discuss the world under climate change in 50 or 100 years, we see apocalyptic scenarios of sea level rise, and scientists have done a great job in predicting and projecting the likely impacts. But we don't have yet a unified vision of what the world would look like if we had managed to fight climate change and to overcome climate change. So, we have a vision of the world that we don't want, but we don't have yet a vision of the world that we want on a global scale. And I think this is the challenge ahead, a challenge not just for scientists, but also for the media and possibly artists, to draw together this aspirational world so that the fight against climate change could become a political project and no longer a constraint that everyone's trying to avoid. Fifth, there is still a problem of isolation, of the idea that climate change could be dealt with independently from other issues such as trade or development, and that climate change could be dealt with environmental policies, with environmental treaties. And I think, and to me, this is one of the other achievements of Paris, that climate change seems to have finally entered the political realm, moving away from the environmental realm. So what does the Paris Agreement look like at the end of the day? I consider it as the best possible deal that could be reached in current circumstances and given the conflictual interests in present. I think that if we were to reorganize COP21 again and again, we could not get a better result. So we need to be, I think, happy of the fact that we've managed to get this best possible deal. And this is clearly a huge success for the French diplomacy. The problem is that this deal is just not enough. As good as it is not enough. There are some strong points, and the 3 key points of the agreement, if one have to describe it, are the fact that it reinstates, surprisingly, the 1.5 degrees objective. That was a demand of developing countries and of small island countries in particular. That was a fight that they had fought in Copenhagen, that they had lost in Copenhagen. And almost by miracle, 6 years later, they managed to win this battle that was so important for them. There is funding for the Green Fund, at least $100 billion, which was another demand of developing countries. And the agreement is universal, that has been adopted by every country of the planet. There are still many other weak points, however. Weak points on climate justice, where the language is not only very weak, but borderline shocking. Human rights are barely mentioned. Migration is also barely mentioned. And there are many, many, many other issues that are barely mentioned. And NGOs are right to say that the agreement is also disappointing in these regards, and this is true. Clearly, the weaknesses of the agreement are completely overshadowed by the 1.5 degrees objective and the universality of the agreement. Let me say a few words of the 1.5 degree objective. It is an objective that is, as we know, completely unrealistic. The temperature has increased by about 1 degree over the past century, and whatever we do, unless we stop emitting, using fossil fuels tomorrow, we will reach the 1.5 degree objective. Yet that was a demand of developing countries, and clearly it's been a strategy of the French presidency to reinstate this objective. And this has been the condition for developing countries to accept all of those weaknesses, because they knew that it was their only shot of getting the 1.5 degree objective in an agreement. Is it useful to have an unrealistic objective in an agreement? Some might say it's completely useless, and I get that point. What's the point of including an objective that you know is impossible to reach, plus an objective by the end of the century? That is, when we will know whether or not we've succeeded or failed in achieving this objective, well, most of the people who have taken this commitment will be dead. All of them, basically. So nobody will ever be held accountable on a personal level of that failure. But some might say the objective should serve as a guide to remind countries that climate change is already a disaster today and already a reality today, and that they need to step up their commitments every 5 years to try and get as close as possible from this 1.5 degree objective. And some had said, well, you know, if we abandon these 1.5 or 2 degrees objectives, as unrealistic as they might seem, that means that we abandon the fight and that we give way to a world of +3, +4, or even +6 degrees. And that all, I think, depends on whether or not these objectives will be taken seriously. What will be the real consequences of this agreement? And I think that the most encouraging signs have really come from the markets. I don't know if many of you have watched the markets on Monday, but the stocks of renewable energy spiked, and the stocks of fuel and coal plummeted. So basically, the markets have indicated that they did not consider the Paris Agreement as bullshit, and that it could have a real impact on markets. And at the end of the day, in the world we live in, the decisions will be made by the markets, that is, by the companies, that is, by us. And I think we should consider the Paris Agreement as a kind of guide, and in many regards, it's only a symbol. and it has only a symbolic value because it's not a binding agreement. It cannot impose anything to anyone. So it's only a symbol. And I see the value of having the 1.5 degree objective as a symbol and as a guide, which can possibly help the markets, companies, and states to guide their action, and I'm hoping that the Paris Agreement can work as a signal. I just want to give another anecdote, but on Monday morning I received an email from a PhD student in international law. And this PhD student was studying at the University of Burgundy and said, well, look, Professor, I'm a little embarrassed. We don't know each other, but I'm writing my PhD thesis in law in international trade law on the oil deals that are made by China in Africa. And his question was, do you think I'm on the wrong side of history? Do you think I should abandon my thesis and change my subject? Because do you think that in 2 or 3 years, there will be any interest for a study on the oil deals made by China in Africa? Like, in 2 or 3 years, will these oil deals still exist? And of course, I had to tell him, well, don't quit. I'm hoping that your thesis subject will be history one day, but realistically speaking, you should be good enough for at least 5 or 10 more years. But I think that this kind of reaction is interesting. That is that even at the level of a PhD student in international law, that is someone not specifically concerned by issues of the environment, they looked at the Paris Agreement and they thought, well, maybe something has changed. And we don't know yet whether the agreement will be a historical one or not. And that will all depend on what the society will make of it. But what has changed, I think, significantly is the fact that for 21 years, the society, the population, the companies were moving quicker than the negotiations. And that the negotiations could barely follow the evolution of the society, and that there was a huge gap between the reality of climate change, of climate action, and of climate policies, and the negotiations themselves. And often you felt that these negotiations were conducted in a bubble, independently from the real world. And maybe for the first time, the negotiations have been reconnected with the real world. And maybe rather than follow actions by companies and by the civil society, for the first time, they can guide these actions. But that will all depend on what we will make of that deal. And so we will only know in 10 or 20 years whether December the 12th was the beginning of the end of fossil fuels or not.